White police officer beats a young black man without knowing who his father is. In El Paso, a small town in the heart of the country, lived Thomas, a 24-year-old man who, despite his young age, had already reached a high rank in the army. The city was known for its quiet streets and friendly residents, but like everywhere, it had its shadows. Thomas, the only child of a military family, had always been a dedicated and disciplined young man. His father, a renowned army officer, and his mother, a retired teacher, had taught him the value of humility and integrity from a young age. Despite his high position, Thomas never let pride take over. He lived simply, drove a modest car, and dressed discreetly, reflecting his humble character and belief in a simple life. His appearance didn't draw attention, and that humility, instilled by his parents, helped him stay grounded. However, on a seemingly ordinary day, life had a challenge in store for him that would test not only his patience but also his faith in justice. It was a hot afternoon in El Paso. The sun was still high in the sky, casting long golden rays over the cobbled streets. The dry leaves, crisp from the lack of rain, crunched under the tires of Thomas's car as he drove down a main avenue. The sound of the tires on the asphalt created a cadence that soothed him, but something broke the harmony of that moment. While waiting at a traffic light, a police car pulled up behind him, and suddenly, an officer named Richard got out of the vehicle, heading straight for Thomas's car. Richard was known in town for his arrogant temperament and prejudiced attitudes. The townspeople knew he liked to impose his authority excessively, and today, Thomas would be his next victim. "Hey, you!" Richard's voice was heard before he even reached Thomas's window. There was something in his tone that immediately tensed the young soldier's body, who tried not to show any emotion. "Whose car is this? I'm surprised to see someone like you driving something like this." Thomas looked up from the steering wheel and, holding back the growing annoyance inside him, responded calmly, "The car is mine, sir. I'm just on my way home." But deep down, Thomas felt the weight of the situation. He knew Richard's attitude wasn't out of mere curiosity, he was being judged by his appearance. It was a silent judgment, disguised as innocent questions, but Thomas knew all too well what was happening. The heat of the day wasn't just external, he felt the temperature rise within him as he tried to keep his composure. Richard looked him up and down with an expression full of contempt. Thomas could feel Richard's eyes scrutinizing him, searching for something to justify the suspicion. "Someone like you, dressed like that, shouldn't even be behind the wheel of a car like this," Richard said with a mocking smile. The tension in the air was palpable. Although Thomas was trained for much more intense situations, he felt a restrained anger. He knew that responding aggressively would only make things worse. He took a deep breath and kept his tone firm but respectful. "I assure you, sir, that the car is mine. I have all the documents in order." The sun was blazing at that moment, and the streets, usually calm, seemed empty. Just a few passers-by watched from a distance, but without getting involved. They knew who Richard was and knew it was best not to cross his path. The policeman's words were full of venom, a venom that Thomas had learned to identify. He had grown up in a society where skin color and appearances often determined how you were treated. And although he had spent years in the army, he was still surprised at how much he had to prove to be respected. Richard didn't give up. He moved closer to the car, peering inside, inspecting it with disdain. "Do you really think anyone's going to believe that a guy like you, with that face and those clothes, owns this car?" Richard raised an eyebrow mockingly. Thomas felt his blood boil, but he remained firm, gripping the steering wheel tightly, recalling his father's words about discipline and self-control. What Richard didn't know was that, discreetly, Thomas had placed his phone on the dashboard of the car, recording the entire incident. Every insult, every look of disdain, was being captured on audio and video. Although Thomas had learned not to react impulsively, something inside him told him that this time, he would have the opportunity to do something about it. Feeling triumphant, Richard continued his abusive behavior. "Come on, get out of the car. I want to check it right here." Let's see what we can find. He was clearly looking for something to incriminate Thomas. But Thomas knew there was nothing suspicious in his car. Everything was in order, and that only increased Richard's frustration. Thomas got out of the car, feeling the officer's gaze piercing his back. He knew it was best to cooperate, but his mind was constantly on alert. "You can check, sir," he said, keeping calm, though the weight of humiliation was starting to take its toll on him. Richard began searching the car with rough movements, rummaging through Thomas's personal belongings with disdain. Every second of that unjustified scrutiny fed into the young soldier's internal indignation. Thomas forced himself to breathe deeply, remembering his father's teachings about self-control in critical situations. While Richard turned over the seats and the glove compartment, Thomas thought about the irony of the situation. He, a decorated army officer, being treated like a criminal simply because of his appearance. The air was thick with tension. Thomas could feel the furtive glances of a few people from the sidewalks, but no one dared to intervene. The sun continued to beat down relentlessly, and the heat radiating from the asphalt made beads of sweat roll down his back. The noise of the city seemed to fade into the background, as if everything around him had frozen in that moment of humiliation. Evidently frustrated by not finding anything incriminating, Richard huffed and turned to Thomas with a cruel look. "You think you can fool me with that humble act of yours," he said, stepping closer to Thomas. The young soldier's muscles tensed. His instincts told him to defend himself, but he knew that any wrong move would only make things worse. "Stay calm," he reminded himself. Suddenly, without warning, Richard landed a punch to Thomas's stomach. The pain was immediate, sharp, forcing him to double over, gasping for air. The surprise was as great as the physical pain. He had never expected things to escalate this far. "This is to teach you not to cross my path," Richard spat with a satisfied smile. Thomas's body reacted to the blow in a way he could barely control. He felt a knot in his stomach and the burn of anger climbing up his chest, but still, he kept his mouth shut. Any word could unleash more violence, and Thomas knew that at that moment, patience was his only weapon. But Richard wasn't finished. With surprising speed, the officer threw another punch, this time to Thomas's face. The policeman's fist hit Thomas's lip, causing him to fall to the ground, blood starting to flow from his mouth. As pain pulsed through his face and ribs, Thomas could barely lift his eyes to see the sadistic grin on Richard's face. "You think it's over?" Richard asked, his tone dripping with contempt. Then, without hesitation, he kicked Thomas in the ribs, causing such sharp pain that it nearly knocked the wind out of him. Thomas writhed on the ground, trying not to scream. Every part of him urged him to get up, to fight back, but his mind was still dominated by the need for self-control. His military training hadn't just taught him to fight physically but also to resist mentally. However, this was a harder battle. At that moment, lying on the ground with pain coursing through his entire body, Thomas felt more vulnerable than he ever had in a combat zone. "You're nothing," Richard yelled, his voice full of hatred. "Nothing." And with those words, the officer crouched down, grabbing Thomas's face roughly and whispered, "Remember that the next time you think about leaving home with that car. You don't belong here." Gasping from the pain, Thomas managed to look at Richard with a mixture of anger and contempt, but he forced himself not to respond. He knew there was more at stake here than his immediate dignity. He had evidence, he had the truth on his side, and though now wasn't the time to react, he knew that soon, it would be. Finally, Richard stood up, took one last look at Thomas, and said, "Get out of here before I change my mind and decide to do something worse." Slowly, Thomas got to his feet, every movement painful, but he forced himself to stand tall. Without saying a word, he got back into his car. As he started the engine and began to drive away, the physical pain mixed with the fury in his mind. Every punch, every insult still echoed in his thoughts. He tasted the metallic tang of blood in his mouth, and his ribs ached with every breath. With a trembling hand, Thomas touched his swollen lip, feeling the blood. But beyond the physical pain, what hurt the most was the humiliation. Such raw and direct racism and abuse of power had reminded him that, despite all his achievements, in some people's eyes, the color of his skin still made him inferior. The thought filled him with helplessness, but it also strengthened him. He knew he couldn't let it slide. This time, he wouldn't. As he drove home, his thoughts swung between anger, pain, and strategy. His phone, still recording, held all the evidence he needed. Every word, every blow was there, and Thomas knew he would use that evidence to seek justice. Richard might have won that little battle in the street, but Thomas would make sure to win the war. In the following days, Thomas couldn't stop replaying the moment in his head. Nights were especially difficult. He would lie staring at the ceiling, wondering if it was really worth fighting. Despite the evidence he had, he knew that taking on a police officer like Richard, who likely had connections in the precinct, wouldn't be easy. He had heard stories of others who, despite having the truth on their side, had hit a wall of bureaucracy and cover-ups. In those moments of doubt, he thought about his military career. He had worked his entire life to get where he was, and he feared that by filing a public complaint, he might tarnish his reputation. What if it all backfired? What if no one believed him, or worse, if it all came to nothing? That internal struggle led him to visit his father. He knew he needed advice. He knew that his father, a man who had faced all kinds of adversities, could give him the perspective he needed. And so, one day, he decided he would speak with him. Colonel Johnson put aside his papers and gave his full attention to his son. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier as Thomas began to recount what had happened. He told in detail how he had been stopped by Richard, the racist insults he received, and finally, the physical assaults. As he spoke, his father listened in complete silence, but his eyes reflected a mix of indignation and concern. When Thomas finished, he pulled out his phone and showed his father the recording. Every word, every punch echoed in the small office, filling the space with palpable tension. The colonel listened attentively, and although his face remained calm, his jaw clenched with every insult Richard hurled. When the recording ended, Colonel Johnson remained silent for a few seconds. Finally, he looked up and stared directly into his son's eyes. "You did the right thing by coming to talk to me, Thomas. Situations like this cannot be ignored, and the fact that you remained calm and recorded what happened shows that you are a man of great wisdom," he said, his tone firm but reassuring. Thomas nodded, feeling relieved to have his father's support, but he also knew this was just the beginning. "What should I do now, Dad?" he asked, seeking guidance. Colonel Johnson leaned back in his chair, reflecting for a moment before responding. "With the evidence you have, you should go directly to that officer's superior. But before doing anything, I suggest you talk to your mother. I want her to see those injuries, but I don't want her to worry too much." Thomas frowned, a bit surprised by the suggestion. "Talk to Mom? I don't want to scare her more than necessary." The colonel shook his head, understanding his son's concern. "Don't tell her the whole truth. Tell her these bruises are from a military training exercise and ask her to help you treat them. The most important thing right now is that you're in your best physical and mental condition for what's to come. And, Thomas, make sure that when you confront this officer, you follow the proper protocol. Justice is not only a right, it's also a responsibility." Thomas knew his father was right. Talking to his mother would be difficult, but it was necessary. "Okay, Dad. I'll do what you say. First, I'll talk to Mom, and then I'll go directly to the precinct." The colonel nodded, rising from his chair and approaching Thomas to give him a hug. "Remember, son, that you have the truth on your side. Don't let injustice win. But always maintain prudence." With his father's embrace, Thomas felt a renewed sense of strength. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was more determined than ever to seek justice. When Thomas arrived at his parents' house, the atmosphere was very different. The familiar smell of homemade food filled the air, and the warm light of the setting sun illuminated the small living room. However, in his mind, the tranquility of the house contrasted with the turmoil he felt inside. His mother was in the kitchen, humming a tune as she prepared dinner. When she saw him walk in, her expression changed immediately. "Thomas! What happened to you?" she exclaimed, dropping a plate she had been drying. Her eyes filled with concern as she saw the bruises on her son's face. Thomas forced a smile, remembering his father's advice. "Don't worry, Mom. It was just a minor incident during training." "Nothing serious," he replied, trying to sound convincing. He knew lying to his mother wouldn't be easy, but he didn't want to worry her more than necessary. She looked at him with a mix of disbelief and concern. "Training? And you couldn't protect yourself?" she asked, examining the bruises and cuts more closely. "You've always been so strong, Thomas." He nodded, trying to steer the conversation away from the truth. "It was an intense simulation, Mom. But I'm okay, really. I just thought you could help me treat these wounds." His mother, though clearly not fully convinced, sighed and went to get the first aid kit. As she applied ointments and bandages to Thomas's injuries, she kept a worried expression. "You know you don't have to hide anything from me, son. If something else happened, you can tell me," she murmured while she worked. Thomas felt a pang of guilt but remembered his father's advice. "I know, Mom. But this time, it really is as I said." "I'll be fine, thanks to you," he said, trying to sound convincing. After a few minutes, his wounds were treated, and Thomas felt physically a little more relieved. He stood up, feeling strong enough to face what lay ahead. "Thanks, Mom. You always know what I need," he said, hugging her before heading for the door. "Be careful, son," she said with a mix of pride and concern in her voice. "And please, don't get into more trouble." Thomas nodded and left the house, with a new sense of clarity. He knew that the next step would be crucial, to confront Richard directly and make sure justice was served. After saying goodbye to his mother, Thomas drove directly to the police station where Richard worked. The journey was silent, but inside his mind, everything was a whirlwind of emotions. The pain in his body was a constant reminder of the assault he had suffered, but what weighed on him the most was the injustice. He kept reminding himself that what he was doing was right, that he couldn't allow someone like Richard to continue abusing his power. As he drove, the city's lights began to turn on, and the shadows of the night started to cover the streets of El Paso. Though anxiety tried to take hold of him, Thomas felt that with every mile bringing him closer to his destination, he was filled with new strength. This time, he wasn't alone, he had the truth on his side. When he arrived at the police station, he parked his car in front of the building. As he got out, the cool night air hit him, but it failed to calm the nerves he felt, knowing that he was about to confront the man who had humiliated and beaten him. Dressed in his impeccable military uniform, Thomas knew that his presence would make an impression. His uniform represented authority, discipline, and respect, everything that Richard had failed to show. Thomas walked toward the station's main entrance with firm steps, trying to project a confidence he was still struggling to maintain. Upon entering, he immediately felt the eyes of the police officers on him. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with recognition. They knew he wasn't just an ordinary citizen, but an army officer, and his presence was no longer going unnoticed. Heading straight to the reception desk, Thomas spoke to the woman behind the counter. "Good evening," he said in a calm but firm voice. "I'm Officer Thomas Johnson. I would like to speak urgently with the commander of this precinct." The receptionist, impressed by his posture and the military rank he proudly wore, nodded immediately. "One moment, Officer Johnson. I'll inform the commander of your arrival." While waiting, Thomas mentally prepared himself. He knew that this conversation wouldn't just be crucial for him but also for ensuring that Richard faced the consequences of his actions. It was no longer just about him, it was about justice for anyone who might have suffered the same at the hands of that police officer. A few minutes later, Commander Martinez, a middle-aged man with a firm posture and serious look, appeared at the reception. Upon seeing Thomas, respect was reflected in his eyes. "Good evening, Officer Johnson. I'm Commander Martinez. How can I assist you?" he said, shaking Thomas's hand firmly. Without hesitation, Thomas returned the handshake and responded, "Good evening, Commander. I would like to speak with you in private about a serious matter involving one of your officers." Martinez noticed the seriousness in Thomas's voice and immediately nodded. "Of course, officer. Follow me to my office." Leading Thomas through the halls of the precinct, the commander brought him to a small but orderly office. Once they closed the door, the commander gestured for him to sit. "I'm at your disposal. What's this about?" Thomas took a deep breath. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment to confront the abuse he had suffered. "Commander, a few days ago, I was stopped by one of your officers, Officer Richard. What should have been a routine interaction turned into an experience of power abuse, racism, and physical assault. I was insulted, humiliated, and without any reason, physically attacked." As Thomas spoke, his tone remained firm, but his words carried the weight of indignation and justice. Commander Martinez frowned, clearly concerned by what he was hearing. "These are very serious accusations, Officer Johnson. Do you have any evidence to support what you're saying?" Thomas nodded and pulled out his phone from his pocket. "Yes, Commander. I recorded the entire incident with my phone. Every insult, every punch is captured here." He turned on the device and began to play the recording. In the small office, the air seemed to grow thicker as the sound of the assault filled the space. Richard's arrogant voice, his racist insults, and the physical blows echoed clearly. Commander Martinez, visibly disturbed, leaned back in his chair as he listened. His face shifted from surprise to disappointment, and finally, to a severe expression of indignation. When the recording ended, the commander remained silent for a few moments, processing what he had just heard. Finally, he spoke, his voice now loaded with seriousness. "This is absolutely unacceptable. Officer Richard's behavior does not reflect the values of our police force, and it cannot be tolerated on any level," Martinez said firmly. "Officer Johnson, I want to assure you that this matter will be treated with the utmost seriousness. Richard will face the consequences of his actions." Thomas, feeling a mix of relief and tension, nodded. "Thank you, Commander. I'm not doing this just for myself but for anyone else who might have suffered the same." Commander Martinez stood up from his chair, his expression resolute, and made a quick phone call to his subordinate. "Bring Officer Richard to my office immediately," he ordered, his voice full of authority. A few minutes later, the door to the office opened, and Richard walked in, initially not recognizing Thomas. He still wore his usual arrogant attitude, as if nothing had happened. But when his eyes met Thomas's, recognition flashed across his face, and his confidence vanished instantly, replaced by fear. "Commander, why was I called here?" Richard asked, his voice now trembling. Commander Martinez fixed him with a hard stare, leaving no room for excuses. "Richard, you have been called to account for your actions. Officer Johnson has presented evidence that you physically and verbally assaulted him, acting in a racist and abusive manner. As of this moment, you are under arrest and will face a trial for what you've done." Richard stammered, trying to defend himself. "But Commander, I didn't know who he was. I didn't think." The commander cut him off immediately. "It doesn't matter who he is, Richard. What matters is that your behavior was unacceptable and will not be tolerated in this precinct or any other. You have failed in your duty to protect and serve the community with dignity and respect." Thomas watched as two officers entered the office and began to handcuff Richard. The officer tried to verbally resist, but his words faded into the air. "This is a mistake. You can't do this to me." Richard yelled, but he no longer had control of the situation. Meanwhile, Thomas felt a sense of relief and justice. He knew the journey wasn't over yet, but at least the first stage of this battle had come to an end. As Richard was led out of the office, Commander Martinez turned his attention back to Thomas. "Officer Johnson, I want to assure you that this case will be brought before a military tribunal. Richard will face a trial, and justice will be served." Thomas, feeling more at peace for the first time in days, thanked the commander. "Thank you, Commander. I trust that justice will be done." With those words, Thomas left the precinct with his head held high. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but now he was sure he had done the right thing. A few days after Richard's arrest, Thomas received a call he had been anxiously awaiting but also filled him with nervousness. It was an army officer informing him that Richard's trial would take place in a military tribunal. Due to the seriousness of the case and the fact that it involved both a police officer and a member of the army, the trial would be conducted under strict military regulations. Thomas was asked to present all the evidence he had and was invited to bring any witnesses who could support his version of the events. The day of the trial approached quickly, and with it, the pressure on Thomas grew. He knew it would be an emotionally exhausting process, not only because he would have to relive the incident but also because it would test his ability to remain composed under the scrutiny of high-ranking military officers. The night before the trial, Thomas spent several hours reviewing the recording on his phone, making sure everything was in order. He felt the responsibility not only to seek justice for himself but also to represent all those who had been victims of similar abuse but never had the opportunity to defend themselves. The next day, Thomas, accompanied by his father and Commander Martinez, arrived at the military tribunal, a solemn and austere building located within the military base. The atmosphere was serious, as expected in a case of such gravity. High-ranking officers filled their seats in the courtroom, while the judge, a general with an impeccable reputation, prepared to hear both sides of the case. Thomas, dressed in his military uniform with impeccable pride, walked to his seat, feeling the weight of the moment. He knew that this wasn't just a confrontation between him and Richard, but a battle for the principles of justice and equality. When the judge finally took his place, silence filled the room. "We are gathered today to judge the case of Officer Richard, accused of abuse of power, racism, and physical assault against Officer Thomas Johnson," the judge announced with a firm voice. "Let the trial begin." The military tribunal had an intimidating air. Richard was brought into the room in handcuffs, and his usual arrogant attitude had disappeared entirely. Now, in its place, was a man who knew that his actions had brought him to a point of no return. Thomas, from his seat, observed the man who had humiliated him just days earlier now standing in a position of total vulnerability. The judge asked Thomas to give his testimony. Firmly, the young officer stood up and walked to the center of the room. The gazes of the high-ranking officers were fixed on him, but Thomas maintained his composure. He knew that what he said next would determine the course of the trial. "Sir, on the day in question, I was stopped without cause by Officer Richard. During the interaction, I was insulted, humiliated, and physically assaulted because of my appearance and skin color," Thomas began, recounting the events with precision. "However, knowing the situation could escalate, I decided to record the entire incident with my phone. I present the recording as evidence." The judge nodded, and the recording was played in the courtroom. The sounds of the insults, Richard's cruel laughter, and the punches echoed in the silence. As the recording played, murmurs of disapproval began to rise among the officers present. It was clear that everyone understood the gravity of what had happened. When the recording ended, the judge turned his attention back to Thomas. "Officer Johnson, do you have any witnesses you would like to present to support your testimony?" "Yes, sir," Thomas responded. "I would like to call Colonel Johnson, my father, and Commander Martinez, who worked directly with the accused." Colonel Johnson was the first to rise. His presence in the courtroom commanded immediate respect. He walked to the center of the room, and the judge acknowledged him with a nod. "Colonel Johnson, what can you tell us about your son and how he handled this situation?" the judge asked. Colonel Johnson looked directly at the judge and then at the room, his voice resonating with authority. "My son, Thomas, has been an exemplary officer, both in his personal and professional life. He was raised with the values of honor, integrity, and respect, values that he demonstrated through his actions during this incident. Despite being humiliated and abused, he chose not to react violently, but instead acted with the wisdom that has been instilled in him. The colonel paused before continuing, his tone growing heavier. However, I stand here not as a father but as a military officer. And as a military man, I can tell you that Officer Richard's behavior is absolutely unacceptable and must be punished according to the rules and regulations that we all respect. Colonel Johnson's testimony left a significant impact on the courtroom. His authority was undeniable, and his words further reinforced Thomas's credibility. Next, Commander Martinez took his place. As Richard's direct superior, his testimony was crucial. Richard has been a competent officer in some respects, but his arrogant and prejudiced behavior has never been tolerable. This incident is not an isolated case. There have been other minor incidents that, although not as severe, showed a pattern of behavior that finally culminated in this act of abuse against Officer Johnson. The commander's words painted a clear picture of Richard's conduct, making it evident that this was not a single mistake but part of a larger issue. After hearing the testimonies, the judge withdrew to deliberate. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity for Thomas, who sat between his father and Commander Martinez. Although he had done everything in his power, the outcome now depended on the court's decision. Finally, the judge returned to the courtroom. Everyone stood in respect. The judge took his seat and began to speak with the same solemnity as before. After considering all the evidence and testimonies presented, this court finds Officer Richard guilty of abuse of power, racism, and physical assault. As a result, he will be relieved of his duties in the police force, serve time in a military prison, and pay significant compensation to Officer Thomas Johnson as reparation for the harm caused. Thomas felt an immense sense of relief. After days of uncertainty and inner struggle, justice had finally prevailed. Richard, now officially condemned, was led out of the courtroom by other officers. He was no longer the arrogant man who had abused his authority, but someone who would now face the consequences of his actions. Years passed after the incident, but Thomas's life was never the same. The trial not only gave him justice, but also a new sense of purpose. After the trial, Thomas decided to dedicate part of his military career to defending human rights within the armed forces. He became an active advocate against racism and abuse of power, giving talks and conducting training within the army to ensure that what happened to him would never happen to anyone else. His military career continued to flourish, and he rose to positions of greater responsibility. However, Thomas never forgot the lessons he learned during that dark gap of his life, the importance of justice, patience, and integrity. And though the emotional scars of that day stayed with him, they also strengthened him, making him a more aware and just leader. The small town of El Paso was never the same after that trial. Thomas's case became an example of how, even in the quietest of places, justice can prevail, and how the courage of one person can inspire many to fight for what is right.